So the table saw is one of the most useful tools in a woodworking shop, but unfortunately it's also the cause of thousands of accidents every year. In the US alone, there are an estimated 30,000 table saw related injuries annually, with a projected economic cost of over $2 billion. Thankfully, most of these kinds of injuries can easily be avoided by following the best practices I'm going to lay out in this video. Plus, I'm going to be giving away my personal SawStop job site table saw to hopefully help keep one of y'all a little safer. So before we dive into some safety tips, let's talk about the anatomy of a table saw, because knowing how these machines function will obviously help you set up the saw properly. So working our way from the top down, we start with an accessory that a lot of people seem to avoid using, the blade guard. If you don't have a blade guard, there will most likely be a riving knife or splitter located here. If your saw has neither of these, I would honestly probably stop using it until you can add at least one of these safety features. That's how important they are, in my opinion. Next up is the blade, and surrounding the blade are the throat plate and the table itself. There are also channels cut into the surface of the table called miter slots, which can work in tandem with various table saw accessories we'll cover later. The rip fence slides across the table, setting the width of your cut, and the fence usually interfaces with some kind of rail to lock it in place. Below the table are the real meat and potatoes of the saw, where the controls and motor are located. Typically, a table saw will have a switch mounted just below the front rail, as well as a hand wheel for adjusting the blade height. There's also a mechanism for adjusting the bevel angle of the blade, and this can come in the form of another hand wheel, like with this saw, or in the case of some smaller job site saws, this will usually be controlled with some kind of lever or other mechanism. The motor itself is usually mounted inside the base, and the motor drives the blade through the arbor, which is connected to the motor with a belt on larger saws like this one, or directly on smaller saws. Finally, we have the base itself, which might just be a few plastic feet on smaller saws, but on my cabinet saw, this is made up of a much larger cabinet which sits on a mobile base. So now that we're familiar with the anatomy of a table saw, let's talk about how to set it up to get the most out of it. First things first, you should verify that the face of your fence is square to the table, and you should make sure the fence is either parallel to the miter slots or slightly toed out. If the fence is toed in towards the blade, this will increase your chance of running into kickback, which is, in my opinion, one of the most dangerous safety hazards when working with a table saw. So kickback happens when your workpiece is bound up with the blade, which is usually caused by the piece pinching the blade or by the user inadvertently rotating the workpiece. And when this happens, the piece rides up on the blade and is fired back towards the user like a rocket. So this is bad enough since your workpiece is turned into some kind of wooden weapon, but it can get way worse when your hand holding that workpiece is also pulled towards the blade, sometimes into the blade. And kickback happens in milliseconds, so no matter how fast your reaction time is, you're not going to win a race against a table saw. Thankfully, there is a very simple fix for avoiding kickback, and that's installing a riving knife, splitter, or a blade guard with an integrated riving knife. All of these accessories effectively eliminate kickback caused by the rotation of a workpiece, plus they massively reduce the chance of kickback from a piece pinching the blade. That said, this type of kickback can still happen even with a riving knife, and it's something I experienced personally early on in my woodworking journey. I was ripping a narrower strip of cherry, and before I knew it, the piece had wrapped around the back of the riving knife with enough tension to also bind itself with the blade, and the piece was shot back at my garage door, leaving a pretty massive dent. Thankfully, I was following another huge safety tip when it comes to working on the table saw, which is to avoid standing directly behind the piece you're cutting. And this is especially important when ripping strips of things like hardwood or dimensional lumber, since they tend to have a ton more tension in them versus something like sheet goods. So I tend to stand to the left of the board when making rip cuts, although if you're making miter cuts, they can also fire offcuts in this area. So you'll just need to do some trial and error depending on what exactly you're cutting and how your table saw is set up. Let's take a second to talk about the sponsor of this week's video, Upside. So Upside is a free app that gets you cash back on daily essentials like gas, groceries, and dining. And considering it's time for school to start back up for my kids, that means more carpool lines, sports, eating on the go, and everything else, which makes this the perfect time to start using Upside. So there are over 100,000 gas stations, grocery stores, and restaurants on the Upside app, meaning cashback is always just around the corner. Upside has no confusing rewards, points, or credits, just actual cashback you can transfer straight to your bank account. To get started, claim an offer for whatever you're buying on Upside, then pay as usual with a credit or debit card, follow the steps in the app, and then get paid. And people can usually earn up to 3 times more cash back with Upside than any other product, and this includes loyalty programs and credit card rewards. Top Upside earners are getting as much as $300 back a month, so to find out how you could earn, click the link in the description below or scan the QR code to download Upside, then use my code CRAFTED to get an extra 25 cents back for every gallon on your first tank of gas. Thanks again to Upside for sponsoring this week's video, and let's get back to work. So back to setup, after getting your fence dialed in, you'll want to look at the type of blade that's installed on your saw. If it's the stock blade, it's probably honestly a piece of junk that should only really be used in a pinch. Otherwise, you should purchase a good quality blade that's designed for the type of work you're going to be doing. For example, if you're ripping a bunch of hardwood strips for a batch of cutting boards, the last thing you want to do is install a blade designed for cutting sheet goods. The high tooth count will build up tons of friction, plus the geometry of the teeth and the layout of the gullets will have a really hard time properly clearing the sawdust generated by the cut. And these things will combine to make the act of actually pushing the board through the blade a lot harder, requiring a ton more effort, and it's much easier to make an unnecessary error when exerting that kind of force. This kind of friction buildup can also lead to kickback, and this is probably what happened to me when I was ripping that cherry, because it took me a lot of years to realize that I should probably be changing my table saw blades multiple times throughout each project for the best results. And it's kind of the same idea as with knives. You might have heard the saying, a dull knife is a dangerous knife. And because you have to push a lot harder than with a sharp knife, any slip up can have pretty major consequences. Once you've installed the blade, get it tightened by tightening down the arbor nut, and you don't need to go nuts here. It really just needs to be snug. So next, get your riving knife installed, or better yet, install your blade guard. And as I mentioned, it seems like a lot of people avoid using their blade guards, and I get that some of the factory blade guards can be pretty garbage, but if you can get your hands on a better quality version, I would highly recommend it. Not only does a blade guard obviously keep your hand away from the blade, it can also really improve your dust collection. And this is especially true if you have one like mine, which can be connected to your dust collection system. And through the magic that is 3D printing, you can adapt even the crappiest of blade guards to work with your dust collection setup, and your lungs will thank you. Before turning on the saw, you should also set the blade height. And a pretty good rule of thumb is for the bottom of the gullets, which are these kind of cutouts here, to be even with the top of the workpiece. And by having less blade exposed, it'll help to reduce kickback and the likelihood of your fingers getting friendly with the blade. So now that we've covered some saw setup, let's talk about some best practices when actually using the saw. So first and foremost, do not use your table saw freehand without the rip fence guiding your workpiece. And I see this on a shocking number of job sites, and while it might work sometimes, it's also a major recipe for kickback. Next, make sure your material isn't excessively warped or twisted, because this not only makes it hard to run the material up against the fence, it also means there's probably a lot of tension built up into the board. If you have a board like this, I'd recommend using a bandsaw if you have one available, or just picking a different piece of material if not. Next, don't crosscut boards that are significantly wider than they are long without a miter gauge. And I make exceptions to this rule when working with larger sheet good panels, because it's typically pretty easy to keep the panel firmly up against the fence and resist twisting. If you need to crosscut a narrower board, use a miter gauge or a crosscut sled. Both of these accessories slide in the miter slots I mentioned earlier, and they help keep your saw safer by supporting the board along its length, which prevents twisting. Speaking of miter gauges, you might also want to use your rip fence as a stop block to help make repeatable crosscuts with your miter gauge. And that's totally fine, but before doing that, you need to attach some kind of spacer block or reference block. And this reference block will help keep the offcut from being pinched between the fence and the blade, which is another major cause of kickback. My next tip is to use a good push stick. And there are tons of push stick designs out there. And let's talk about some of my personal favorites and some of my least favorites. So in the least favorite category is the push stick included with most table saws, which is honestly a terrible design. It's hard to keep good control of your workpiece, and in my experience is really only useful for supporting the offcut side of your workpiece. Another popular push stick that I'm not a huge fan of is the Micro Jig Gripper. It's an interesting design and it works pretty well, but it basically forces you to remove the blade guard, which seems like a miss from a safety standpoint. The gripper is good for ripping narrower strips, but I think a bandsaw is much better suited for this, or if you don't have a bandsaw, I'd personally use a thin rip jig when making these kind of cuts. My favorite push stick, and one I've probably been using for close to a decade at this point, is the Bighorn. It's a big push stick, which means your hands are further from the blade, plus it has a large grippy section that helps keep your board under control. There's also a little retractable hook on the back end, which further improves your control. When I'm cutting dados or working with larger panels, I also really like using these rubber grout floats. And I've been using these as push blocks on my jointer and router table for years, but they work just as well here at the table saw when you need to keep more vertical pressure on the workpiece, like when you're cutting dados. My next tip is to really think through cutting thicker or tougher materials, and this is especially true on job site table saws. If you're tripping breakers constantly, you probably need to change something about your setup. And that could include installing a blade better suited for the work you're doing, slowing down your feed rate, or when cutting the toughest of materials, just making your cuts in multiple passes. Next is something I'm definitely guilty of putting off, and that is keeping your saw well maintained. Over time, things like vibration and wear and tear will cause nuts and bolts to loosen, fences to get out of whack, dust to build up, and belts to stretch. And these can all lead to problems with your saw. It's probably a good idea to set up some kind of recurring reminder or calendar event on your phone to help keep up with this kind of tool maintenance. And doing this will not only make your saw safer to use, it'll also help extend the life of your investment. So those are some of my table saw safety basics, but there are always more things you can do to further add to your shop safety. For example, there are a ton of accessories you can add to your saw, like power feeders, which can massively reduce the likelihood of injury, especially in more production-oriented shops. That said, those can cost as much as some table saws, so I don't expect everyone to run out and grab one. The same goes for these JESSM stock guides I added to my saw recently. They're really helpful and will definitely reduce the chance of kickback, but they're also on the expensive side. Another great table saw accessory that can be a lot less expensive is some kind of in-feed or out-feed support. And having something to catch the pieces you're running across the saw significantly reduces the amount of pressure you need to keep on the board during the cut, and it also gives you more flexibility on where you actually position yourself while cutting. Another thing I haven't mentioned is the fact that the specific brand of table saw I use, SawStop, features a safety functionality that makes it pretty much impossible to give myself a 4-finger discount. And as I'm sure you've already seen, these saws sense the electrical current in your hand when it touches the blade, and within milliseconds, they fire a block of aluminum into the blade, which both stops the blade and pulls it below the surface of the table. That said, I still treat my SawStop saws just like I would any other table saw, but it is nice to know that I won't have to give up my guitar playing because of my table saw. Also, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be giving away my personal SawStop job site saw to one lucky viewer. That said, because of the sheer size of the saw, it's going to be local pickup only here in Asheville, unless you want to cover the cost of freight shipping. And I'll have a link to the giveaway in the description below if you'd like to get entered. And I think I'll pick a winner at the Crafted Workshop Garage Sale, which, in case you missed it, is happening on September 27th here in Asheville, North Carolina. And hopefully the winner will be there to pick up their new saw. If you guys have any other table saw safety tips, I'd love to hear them in the comments. And if it's your first time here, go ahead and get subscribed and ring the notification bell so you don't miss my future videos. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, happy building.